Timbuktu fulfilled all of Jonas's expectations, precisely because he had no expectations. As they drove in from Kibara, for several hours the entire town was enveloped in a sandstorm. Because of the wind, the city was just not there. Jonas was thrilled. He had arrived in a fog, a foreign nebula. The sandstorm underscored his certainty that he was not about to visit a city, but a word, a name that delineated reality's border. Jonas Wergeland, the main character in the Norwegian author Jan Hjerstad's novel The Seducer, is not the only one who has perceived Timbuktu as a concept. In fact, few places in the world have been as much an object of mythical imagination as Timbuktu. For several centuries, Europeans believed that this desert town was an African eldorado. But with the discoveries in the 19th century, this myth was gradually replaced by the idea that Timbuktu was an inaccessible place, the most remote of all places, the end of the world. However, for people who live in the unknown, things look different.
Moi, je suis Ali Farka Toure de Tombouctou. Les gens pensaient que Tombouctou c'est le bout du monde, loin de là. Tombouctou c'est le centre du monde.
Tombouctou, cette ville tant renommée, tant connue à travers le monde entier, avait joué un rôle extrêmement important à travers les vicissitudes de son histoire, surtout au XVe et au XVIe siècle. En ces temps, ce n'était pas comme aujourd'hui. Tombouctou n'était pas enclavé. C'est comme si c'était un grand port au bord de la mer. Et cette mer était le Sahara immense. Et les vaisseaux qui traversaient ce Sahara, c'était les chameaux.
The image of Timbuktu as an eldorado, the image which it acquired in Europe, I think goes back probably as far as the 14th century. This is the first time that Timbuktu appears on a European map. It's mentioned on a map of 1375 drawn by Jewish cartographers in Majorca. That itself is a reflection, no doubt, of the famous pilgrimage of Mansa Musa to Mecca in 1324, because this map itself shows him sitting on a throne with a gold crown on his head, and beside it, it says, this is Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, one of the richest kings in the world because of the great store of gold which he has.
Mansa Musa's caravan is said to have been the largest that ever has crossed the Sahara. In addition to bringing with him 60,000 servants and slaves, he also brought with him great quantities of gold.
Et c'était aussi les visiteurs qui l'ont vu, qui écrivaient en arabe, qui ont vraiment fait connaître Tombouctou, tels que les premiers explorateurs, tels que Ibn Battuta, qui est venu ici en 1353, tel que Léon l'Africain qui est venu en 1510-1512.
These travel reports and the caravans bearing gold reaching the northern fringes of the Sahara stimulated the European interest in geographical discoveries.
So I think that's how the legend first starts in Europe. Later, I think it was continued by travelers in North Africa, particularly people, Europeans who were in Morocco, and, for example, saw caravans of gold arriving from Timbuktu. Of course, Timbuktu was not itself a source of gold, it was merely a trade town. The gold itself came from much farther away.
In reality, the gold came from Guinea. It was transported up the Niger River on canoes. But the image of a splendid and rich Timbuktu persisted well into the 19th century, until the first European adventurers managed to reach Timbuktu and return alive. Obviously, the history of Timbuktu starts long before the Europeans ever heard about the town. It begins here, by a dry well in the middle of modern Timbuktu. For the historians of Timbuktu, this well is at the heart of the establishment of the town.
D'après le Tarikh Soudan, un livre d'histoire écrit par un Tombouctien de cette ville, Tombouctou a été fondé vers la fin du XIe siècle. En effet, à cette date, il y avait des Tuaregs qui nomadisaient entre le fleuve au sud et Arawan au nord.
Les Touaregs étaient venus vers l'Afrique noire en bandes successives, dont les premiers même seraient venus peut-être depuis le 7e siècle. Il semblerait que vers le 11e siècle, ils ont fondé la ville de Tombouctou, Timbuctu. Quand ces Touaregs descendaient au bord du fleuve pendant la saison sèche, ils y restaient pendant tous les mois de la saison sèche. Et ce campement qui était là avait une servante qui s'appelait Buctu et qui était restée, c'est avec elle qu'on laissait tous les bagages et les gardait jusqu'au retour. Cet emplacement, à force de la fixation de Buctu, s'est fondé un marché, c'est devenu un point de rencontre des caravanes et c'est devenu Timbuctu.
But the Tuareg nomads were not the only people living in the Timbuktu area in this period. The Songhais, who are traditionally sedentary farmers, give another version of the origin of Timbuktu. According to their history, Buctu was a Songhai woman who dug out the well in Timbuktu with her bare hands. While the ways of making a living of the Tuaregs and the Songhai are complementary, they also compete for land along the Niger River. They use the myths of Buctu to support their own rights to and control over land and resources. While the Tuaregs raised livestock and led caravans through the desert, the Songhai farmed the fertile land along the river Niger and developed a reputation as merchants. The place of Buctu was strategically situated just above the bend of the Niger River, the river which, almost contrary to nature, runs from the west coast and towards the Sahara. It is said that the Niger attempts what the Nile achieves, to cross the Sahara. But when the Niger reaches the fringes of the desert, it changes its mind and takes a wide turn in an easterly direction, before it turns south towards the ocean. Before it turns, the Niger spreads its waters over a wide area, which forms the Niger Delta, one of the most fertile areas in Africa. The great West African kingdoms built a large part of their wealth on the resources of this delta, and subsequently they conquered Timbuktu. But these series of conquests do not seem to have had a tremendous impact on the daily lives of the citizens of Timbuktu. They continued their daily activities and let the conquerors continue theirs.
C'est un lieu de brassage multiracial entre toutes les ethnies. Donc Tombouctou vivait son âge d'or et les gens étaient très contents. On trouvait tous les produits nord-africains comme tous les produits soudanais. Ce sont les caravanes de chameaux et les villes sahariennes et maghrébines qui ont fait en grande partie la prospérité économique de Tombouctou. Maintenant, les produits les plus importants qui venaient du nord, c'était les produits sahariens et maghrébins. Le sel, les tissus, les verroteries, les métaux sous forme de bijoux, les dattes, les épices qui viennent de l'Inde. Et ceux-ci viennent à Tombouctou. Et on disait que Tombouctou était la rencontre du chameau et de la pirogue. Et au sud, par les pirogues, venaient d'autres produits tant recherchés, tels que l'or, les esclaves, les épices de Guinée, le miel, les céréales, les beurres de karité. Donc Tombouctou grouillait de monde, le monde blanc et le monde noir. C'était l'harmonie. Et cette richesse que les gens avaient, c'était vraiment un soubassement solide pour l'éclosion culturelle.
Timbuktu, of course, is famous not only for its gold, but for the depth of its Islamic tradition, Islamic learning. People talk of a University of Timbuktu. I think that may be something of a myth or perhaps a wrong way to describe it. It certainly was a great center of learning in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. Many scholars gathered there, and around them gathered groups of students who studied with them. Right to this day, there are scholars in Timbuktu who continue to have teaching circles of students who come not only from Timbuktu but from quite distant places. Many of these scholars have their own libraries, and many of these scholars continue to write in Arabic.
Thousands of books and manuscripts are conserved, and while most of them are of a religious character, they also give us knowledge about the history of the town. There are also many books with a scientific content and on various topics. In 18th century Europe, the need for discoveries of new land and new resources took off. Due to its inaccessibility, the interior of Africa was the last area to be explored and mapped. The first to reach Timbuktu would achieve great honor and fame. Many tried, but before they reached Timbuktu, they either had died of diseases or had been attacked and killed by devout Muslims who didn't accept Christians in this part of the world. Then there were plundering desert nomads to evade. The Scot, Mungo Park, was the first European to come back with a written account from this area. In 1795, aged 24, he started on his first journey to map the river Niger and to find Timbuktu, but he had to return before reaching his final destination. He did not return from his second attempt. Unfortunately for Park, at that time Timbuktu was controlled by militant Muslims who fought a holy war. On his first trip, he was robbed of all his possessions and had to admit defeat. 10 years later, Park tried again, this time heavily armed. At Kabara, the port of Timbuktu, he shot at all the canoes approaching, but he didn't dare to enter the town. Instead, he continued along the river, only to perish in a waterfall a few days later. Among his crew of 45, the only survivor was Isako, also the only African in his company. A few years later, another Scot attempted to be the first white man in Timbuktu. After a painful journey across the Sahara, involving attacks from nomads and great damages, Major Gordon Lang reached Timbuktu in 1826. In a letter he wrote, "I have no time to give you my account of Timbuktu, but shall briefly state that in every respect except in size, it has completely met my expectations." He also mentions that he has suffered 24 injuries, of which 18 were serious. His handwriting indicates that he may have lost his right arm, but he does not complain. "I am nevertheless doing well, and hope yet to return to England with much important geographical information. This letter is the first to have been written by a European in Timbuktu. Strangely enough, it arrived at its destination, but its author didn't. He was attacked and allegedly strangled with his own turban on his way from Timbuktu. Apart from a few European sailors, who by force had been led to Timbuktu as slaves, the Frenchman René Caillet was the first European to have reached Timbuktu and to return alive. In contrast to the other explorers, he chose to travel disguised as a Muslim. Caillet traveled in constant fear of being discovered as a Christian and of being killed or enslaved for that reason. Caillet was robbed of all his possessions and became seriously ill. Without the help of local people, he would never have achieved the purpose of his journey. On the 19th of April 1828, Caillet arrived in Timbuktu. The journey from the coast had taken him a year. On entering this mysterious city, which is an object of curiosity and research to the civilized nations of Europe, I experienced an indescribable satisfaction. The transport of delight which Caillet felt when he saw Timbuktu at a distance for the first time was soon turned into disappointment. I looked around and found that the sight before me did not answer my expectations. I had formed a totally different idea of the grandeur and wealth of Timbuktu. The city presented nothing but a mass of ill-looking houses built of earth. Nothing was to be seen in all directions but immense plains of quicksand of a yellowish-white color. Still, though I cannot account for the impression, there was something imposing in the aspect of a great city, raised in the midst of sands, and the difficulties surmounted by its founders cannot fail to excite admiration.
Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah.
In Timbuktu, Caillet mostly stayed indoors, because militant Muslims still controlled the town. After 2 weeks, he decided to return to Europe. It would have been easier to travel back along the same route. But he knew that his account would be met with both envy and disbelief. To increase the reliability of his story, he chose to continue towards the north, together with a camel caravan. After his arrival in France, Caillet was able to cash in the prize that had been promised to the first to reach Timbuktu. He was applauded as a hero in his own country, but abroad he was dismissed as a fraud. The most severe criticism came from England, where Caillet's travel account was questioned, and he was criticized for having traveled disguised as an Arab. At that time, it was not honorable for a good Christian. The fact that he had described Timbuktu as a poor place, far from the eldorado many had imagined, did not make his tale any more credible. But more than 20 years later, one of the greatest but most underestimated explorers was to confirm Caillet's information. He had been recruited in Berlin to take part in a new British expedition to North and Central Africa. The German Heinrich Barth was tailored to be an explorer in Africa. He was both a geographer and an archaeologist, and he spoke Arabic and several other languages fluently. Barth was also a skillful artist. He made detailed drawings and observations of people and nature, and his illustrations undoubtedly contributed to his reliability. Barth set out from Tripoli in North Africa on the 30th of March 1850 with a large and well-equipped caravan. The journey to Timbuktu took him 3.5 years, including in-depth studies of nature and culture en route. On the 7th of September 1853, Barth rode into Timbuktu disguised as a Turkish envoy. For the first time on his journey, this usually fearless man was worried for his safety, not the least because of the radical Muslims who controlled the town. However, Barth was protected by a local wealthy Tuareg who provided him with accommodation. The fear of being killed led Barth to stay inside and on the terrace of his host's house, from where he could observe Timbuktu. After a month, he left the town and established a base in a nomadic camp. He taught himself Tamashek, the language of the Tuareg, and made a dictionary. Through this knowledge of their language, Barth developed a friendship to some Tuareg. This proved to be useful because the Tuareg still controlled areas around Timbuktu. This friendship with local people was also a result of Barth's interest in and respect for African cultures. He was also sincerely worried about the emerging European colonization of Africa. Barth even dreamt about establishing an African army to confront the advancing colonialists. After 8 months in Timbuktu, Barth decided it was time to return to Europe. He successfully crossed the Sahara again and arrived in Tripoli on the 28th of September 1855, after more than 5 years of travels in the interior of Africa. With his detailed descriptions and drawings, Barth brought back irrefutable evidence that the legend about Timbuktu as an eldorado was a myth. By doing this, he had also confirmed and redressed Kaye and his account of Timbuktu. Towards the end of the 19th century, the search for new resources and new markets and the desire to extend territories came to be the main motivation behind the European exploration of Africa. Most of the interior of Africa was still unknown and uncharted, and Britain and France were competing in West Africa to each conquer as much land as possible. Conquering the mysterious city of Timbuktu would bring military honor and fame. The French also had other motives. By controlling the Niger River, they would also control the fertile land in the Niger Delta. Much of the trade across the Sahara went through Timbuktu. This also included the slave trade to Morocco. The French wanted to stop this trade, and they wanted to put an end to the Tuareg's brutal control over Timbuktu. Following a wholly unsuccessful attempt to build a railroad across the Sahara, the French arrived in Timbuktu by boat. Ironically, the town was conquered by the French Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Bonnier led the expedition, which was heading north both on land and on the Niger. He traveled by boat together with 204 Senegalese soldiers, commanded by 22 French officers. In front of him, he had 2 vanguards with cannon boats. In addition, a company of over 1,100 men traveled on land, bringing horses and provisions. The guards were the first to arrive at Kabara, the port of Timbuktu. Instead of waiting for Bonnier, they immediately began attacking the town. On the 28th of December 1893, they left their boats, taking with them a small cannon. With the small cannon pulled behind them, the troops ran the last few hundred meters to the first house they saw. The streets were deserted and the house was empty. In peace and quiet, they mounted the cannon on the terrace of the house, together with the French tricolour, and proclaimed Timbuktu a French possession. The French introduced a new war tactic in what was to become French Sudan. If the inhabitants of a sieged town or village did not surrender immediately, it would be bombed with cannons and the people massacred. Tuareg camps also became victims of this tactic. On the other hand, the Tuareg fought with only swords. This was a fight for honor and prestige.
Tu ne me connaîtras pas sans raison. Tu ne m'utiliseras pas sans honneur. Cette épée m'a été transmise des ancêtres qui l'ont eu il y a plusieurs générations et la transmettaient de génération en génération.
In battles, women and children were excluded and never touched. The Tuareg men, therefore, left women and children in their tents when the French attacked, because they took it for granted that they would not be touched. However, in the long run, the Tuareg did not manage to resist the French war tactic and weapons. In 1917, after 24 years of occupation, the Tuareg gave up the fight. The French had achieved superiority over the area. To justify occupation and the bloody battles against the Africans, the French needed a good argument. They found this in the creation of a new myth, the myth about the careless and indolent natives. According to the colonial authority, local people were not able to manage nature in a fitting scientific manner. Their history of surviving in this environment did not matter. They lacked proper machines, skills, and houses. New livestock species were introduced and presented as models in a sharp contrast to the thin but hardy African species. The French saw it as their civilizing mission to teach the so-called careless and lazy local people about European traditions, and the instructions were given by experts. In 1960, French rule in French Sudan ended. Mali then emerged as an independent country, with Bamako as its capital. It is over 1,200 kilometers from Bamako to Timbuktu, but the travel time to the end of the world is today considerably shorter than in the time of the early explorers. Timbuktu is still an attraction for people with an urge to experience the mythical and the inaccessible. Today, explorers and conquerors have been replaced by tourists. There have been many myths about Timbuktu. While the myth about the careless and indolent local population is less pronounced today, it can still be traced in new claims about desertification and the mismanagement of nature by rural Africans. However, centuries of local knowledge and adaptability to an often hostile physical environment should not be forgotten.
Kalei do agora jere kalei